What made a small island in the Atlantic Ocean, once the edge of the world, become one of the most influential nations in human history? Britain is a land steeped in centuries of history, where each generation has left its mark, changing the face of the country and the world. Over the centuries, the country has been ruled by different peoples, each of whom has left their mark. The Celts, who came to the British Isles in the 8th century BC, created a unique culture and the first settlements. Then, in the 1st century AD, the Romans landed on the islands under the command of Julius Caesar and later Emperor Claudius. The Romans founded cities such as Londinium, modern-day London, and created an infrastructure that greatly influenced the development of the country. But after the fall of the Roman Empire, Britain was invaded by the Anglo-Saxons, who came from the continent in the 5th and 6th centuries. These people created the first Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and played an important role in the establishment of Christianity on the islands. The Middle Ages were a time of intrigue, war, and popular uprisings. The Tudor era brought prosperity and the opening of new horizons, making England a maritime power. The Victorian era marked industrial progress and the transformation of the empire into one of the largest in history. But Britain's journey is not just a story of conquests, great empires, and cultural revolutions. It is the path of a country where science and mysticism intertwine at every turn. And it has not been an easy journey. Invasions, conquests, civil wars, revolutions, and world conflicts have all left their mark. Today, the United Kingdom remains an important political, cultural, and economic center. The country is going through difficult processes, such as leaving the European Union, Brexit, but continues to preserve its traditions and influence on the world stage. But what lies behind the transformation of a small island into a world power? What forgotten secrets of the past have been the foundation of its greatness? What is not on the surface of this story? Britain's history begins long before the first states, cities, or written records. The times we call prehistoric span millions of years and include numerous climate changes, migrations, and technological breakthroughs. All of these have left their marks on the island's landscapes and culture. The earliest traces of humans in Britain date back to around 800,000 years ago. In Norfolk, archaeologists have discovered stone tools belonging to Homo antecessor, one of the earliest species of humans. These people lived in the harsh conditions of the Ice Age, using primitive tools to hunt and process food. However, life on the islands was erratic. Ice ages alternated with warm phases, and sea levels rose and fell. During cold periods, Britain was covered in ice, and its land was connected to Europe by a landmass known as Doggerland. Homo heidelbergensis appeared on the islands about 500,000 years ago. They hunted large animals such as mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, used stone tools, and may have known the basics of language. Later, around 400,000 years ago, they were replaced by Neanderthals, whose footprints have been found in caves such as Swanscombe in Kent. Neanderthals were top-notch hunters who adapted to cold conditions. They built more sophisticated tools, knew how to make fire, and probably hunted collectively. However, about 40,000 years ago they were replaced by modern humans, Homo sapiens. With the emergence of Homo sapiens, a new phase in Britain's history began. These people had more developed brains, complex speech, and the ability to think abstractly. They made fine stone tools, hunted deer and other animals, and even made art. Examples of their work include carved figurines and cave paintings found in Europe. Although few such artifacts have been found in Britain, we know that these people already had the rudiments of culture and social organization. Climate change played a huge role in the lives of early humans. In the last 10,000 years, after the end of the last ice age, Britain began to take its modern shape. The retreat of the glaciers opened up vast areas for settlement. Gradually, sea levels rose and Britain became an island, separated from mainland Europe by the English Channel. The Neolithic, or New Stone Age, began about 6,000 years ago. It was a time of dramatic change. People began to settle down, farm, and build permanent settlements. The economy of that time was based on agriculture and animal husbandry. People grew wheat, barley, kept sheep and cows. They began to use primitive plows and stone sickles, which made harvesting easier. One of the most impressive achievements of this era were the megaliths, massive stone structures created for ritual and social purposes. Stonehenge, built around 3000 to 2000 BC, became the most famous monument of this time. Stonehenge is not just a stone circle. Its construction began around 3100 BC and continued in stages for over 1,000 years. There were ditches and mounds around the central circle, and the stones themselves weighed up to 40 tons. One of the main mysteries of Stonehenge remains its purpose. Scientists suggest that it could have been a temple associated with sun worship, an astronomical observatory, or a burial ground. The arrangement of the stones coincides with the movement of the celestial bodies, suggesting that they were used to determine the seasons. In addition to Stonehenge, there are many other Neolithic monuments in Britain, such as Avebury and Scale Brow in Scotland. These structures attest to the high level of community organization and interaction of the time. By the beginning of the Bronze Age, around 2500 BC, Britain had experienced a new technological breakthrough. People began using the metal bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, to make tools and weapons. The Bronze Age was also a time of trade. Britain was rich in tin, which was exported to other parts of Europe. In return, the islands received jewelry, cloth, and other goods. Archaeological evidence shows that the Bronze Age was a time of social change. More complex forms of organization emerged, probably associated with the emergence of the first chiefs or elites. One striking example of this time is the burial of the leader of Amesbury, found near Stonehenge. This man was buried with a rich array of objects, including gold jewelry and copper tools. The Iron Age, which began around 800 BC, was a new era in the development of Britain. People learned to work iron, which made tools and weapons more affordable. It was during this period that Celtic tribes began to dominate the island. The Celts brought their culture, language, and beliefs to Britain. Their craftsmanship reached a high level. The Celts were renowned for their skillful jewelry and weapons, as well as their wood and stone carvings. The social structure of the Celts was based on clans headed by chiefs. They built fortified settlements known as hill forts, which served as centers of power and trade. Britain's prehistoric era came to an end in 43 AD when Roman legions landed on the island. But traces of this period remain in the architecture, culture, and landscapes. Stonehenge, Celtic fortifications, and ritual sites continue to tell us stories of the land's first inhabitants. Caesar, eager to demonstrate Rome's power, brought an army to British shores, but encountered fierce resistance from the local Celtic tribes. His campaign was more of a reconnaissance campaign, and the Romans soon left the island. A year later, Caesar made a second attempt, this time more successful. His army was able to advance further, and some tribes recognized Rome's supremacy. However, Britain remained formally independent, and Roman interest in the island waned for almost a century. The real conquest of Britain began in 43 AD when Emperor Claudius sent an army under the command of Aulus Plautius. The decision to conquer Britain was motivated by political and economic reasons. The island was rich in minerals such as tin, lead, and silver, and was strategically located. The Roman army landed on the southern coast, meeting resistance from local tribes. One of the most famous moments of the campaign was the Battle of Medway River. This strategically important victory opened the way for the Romans to advance further. Within a few years, most of the south and center of the island had been conquered. However, the northern regions and mountainous Scotland remained unconquered. Within a few years, most of the south and center of the island had been conquered. However, the northern regions and mountainous Scotland remained unconquered. Not all British tribes accepted Roman rule. One of the most dramatic episodes in Roman Britain was the revolt led by Boudicca. queen of the Iceni tribe. After the death of her husband, the king of the Iceni, the Romans seized the tribe's lands and humiliated Boudica by subjecting her and her daughters to cruel treatment. This led to a massive uprising in 60 AD. Boudica amassed an army that, according to some sources, numbered as many as 100,000 men. The rebels destroyed major Roman cities, including Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium. Historians describe gruesome scenes of destruction and murder. However, the Romans, under the command of the governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, managed to gather forces and defeat Boudica's army in a decisive battle. These events led to a strengthening of Roman control over Britain. New forts, fortifications, and roads were built, and the local tribes finally lost their independence. The Roman conquest brought a whole new way of life to Britain. The building of cities was one of the major achievements of the Roman administration. Londinium, founded in 43 AD, quickly became the main city of the province. Its convenient location on the River Thames made it an important trading center. Londinium included an amphitheater, baths, bridges, and fortress walls, many of which remained in use for centuries. Other major cities, such as Camulodunum, the first administrative center, Verulamium, St. Albans, and Eboracum, York, became centers of Roman culture. These cities included forums, basilicas, theaters, and temples. The Romans also built a complex network of roads that connected towns and forts. Roads such as Watling Street and Fosse Way allowed for the rapid movement of troops, goods, and information. These roads were built using advanced technology, including multi-layered foundations and drainage systems. To protect the borders of the province, the Romans built numerous forts. These forts served as a base for legions and auxiliary troops. This wall stretched 117 kilometers from coast to coast and included forts, watchtowers, and gates. It protected Roman Britain from raids by northern tribes and served as a symbol of Rome's power. Later, Antoninus's wall was built to the north. However, it was less successful and soon abandoned. Roman citizens who lived in cities enjoyed amenities such as public baths, aqueducts, and forums. They wore togas, ate fine food, including imported wine, olives, and dried fruit, and participated in festivals dedicated to the Roman gods. The local population, especially in rural areas, continued to live according to their ancestral traditions. Many retained Celtic customs and religion, although they gradually adopted Roman elements. Slavery was an integral part of Roman Britain. Slaves worked in homes, on farms, and in mines, extracting lead that was exported to other parts of the empire. The Romans brought with them a rich culture and religious traditions. Celtic gods mixed with Roman gods to create a unique pantheon. Temples dedicated to Jupiter, Minerva, and other gods were built in Britain. Of particular importance was Christianity, which began to spread in Britain in the 4th century. This process accelerated after the adoption of Christianity by Emperor Constantine the Great. Already at the end of the 4th century, Christianity became the dominant religion of the province. By the beginning of the 5th century, the Roman Empire was weakening. Under pressure from barbarians on the continent and internal crises, Emperor Honorius withdrew his legions from Britain in 410 AD. This decision left the province defenseless against invasions by the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes. After the Romans left, Britain was in a state of chaos. The Roman infrastructure, including roads, cities, and government, gradually fell into disrepair. This was a period of transition, when the island was transformed from a former province of a great empire into an arena for feuds and new invasions. With the departure of the Roman armies, the local Britons, descendants of the Celts and Romans, found themselves defenseless against their enemies. The Picts and Scots from the north began to raid, destroying settlements and seizing land. In desperation, the Britons turned to Germanic tribes, including the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, for help, inviting them as mercenaries. However, the mercenaries quickly realized the weakness of the Britons. Instead of protecting them, the Anglo-Saxons began to seize land for themselves. They drove the local population out of fertile areas and established their own settlements. The process was gradual, But by the end of the 5th century, the Anglo-Saxons had already gained a firm foothold in Britain. The key event of this period was the resistance of King Arthur, a legendary figure whose exploits are celebrated in numerous myths. Although Arthur's historical existence remains disputed, he became a symbol of the Britain's struggle against invasion. With the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, Britain was divided into many small kingdoms. Gradually, the largest of them began to emerge. Wessex, West Saxons, the strongest kingdom, which later became the basis of United England. Mercia, a center of trade and diplomacy, with a rich culture and a powerful army. Northumbria, a northern kingdom famous for its monasteries and intellectual achievements. Kent was one of the first kingdoms to embrace Christianity. These kingdoms often engaged in conflicts over territory and influence. Internal wars weakened them, making them vulnerable to external threats such as the Vikings. Anglo-Saxon society was organized on the principle of clans. The main social unit was the tun, a fortified settlement where several families lived. Each settlement was ruled by an elder who was subordinate to the local king. The life of the Anglo-Saxons revolved around agriculture. People grew crops, raised livestock, and practiced crafts. Women did the housework, weaving and child-rearing, while men hunted and defended their settlement. The crafts of the Anglo-Saxons reached a high level. They created fine gold and silver jewelry, engraved weapons, and carved wooden objects. An example of their craftsmanship is a hoard from Sutton Hoo found in the 20th century. This hoard, including a gold helmet and jewelry, belonged to a noble warrior and testifies to the wealth and culture of the time. The Anglo-Saxons were originally pagans. They worshipped a pantheon of gods who personified natural forces and human qualities. Among them were Wotan, Odin, the god of wisdom and war; Tur, the god of justice; Thor, the protector of people associated with thunder and lightning. Religious rituals included sacrifices, festivals related to the cycles of nature, and worship of sacred groves and springs. However, from the 6th century, the process of Christianization of Britain began. In 597, Pope Gregory the Great sent the missionary Augustine to Kent. With the support of King Ethelbert, Augustine founded the first Christian church in Canterbury. Christianity spread rapidly across the island. The monasteries became centers of education, culture, and craftsmanship. They preserved the knowledge of the ancient world and created the first written monuments in Old English. In the late 8th century, Britain faced a new threat: the Vikings. These Scandinavian warriors arrived on the island, plundering monasteries and settlements. The attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 was the beginning of the Viking Age. The Vikings not only plundered, but also conquered land. They established their kingdom, known as Danelag, which covered much of eastern Britain. Jorvik, modern-day York, became the capital of their dominions. One of the most prominent rulers of the era, Alfred the Great, became a symbol of resistance to the Vikings. As King of Wessex, he defeated the invaders at the Battle of Edington in 878. Alfred introduced sweeping reforms. He strengthened defenses by building a network of burghs, fortified settlements, and created a navy. He also supported education, translated important texts into Old English, and reformed the laws. The Anglo-Saxons left a rich cultural heritage. Their language became the basis of modern English, and the epic poem Beowulf became a pearl of world literature. Monasteries such as Lindisfarne and Whitby became centers of scholarship. It was here that illuminated manuscripts such as the elaborately ornamented Lindisfarne Gospels were produced. The Anglo-Saxon era ended in 1066 when the Normans invaded Britain. At the Battle of Hastings, the last Anglo-Saxon king, Harold II, was killed, and England came under the rule of William the Conqueror. However, the legacy of the Anglo-Saxons continues to live on in the culture, language, and traditions of Britain. Their struggles, culture, and achievements have become an important part of the country's history. The Battle of Hastings, which took place on October 14, 1066, was one of the most significant events in British history. This battle not only ended the Anglo-Saxon era, but also paved the way for the establishment of Norman rule, which radically changed the political, social, and cultural structure of the country. The death of King Edward the Confessor of England in January 1066 triggered a succession crisis. Edward died without leaving any direct heirs, and several claimants asserted their rights to the throne. Harold Godwinson, an Anglo-Saxon chieftain, proclaimed King of Anglo-Saxon Witten-Egmont. William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed that Edward had promised him the throne. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, supported by Harold Godwinson's brother, Tostig. As a result, England faced two invasions at once: the Norwegian king Harold Hardrada and the Norman Duke William. Before the Battle of Hastings, the Anglo-Saxon King Harold was forced to face the Norse threat. On September 25, 1066, he defeated Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. It was a hard-fought battle in which the Anglo-Saxon army demonstrated outstanding resilience and tactical skill. However, the victory cost Harold dearly. His army was exhausted and weakened, and he had barely had time to return south when the Normans landed. William the Conqueror arrived in southern England in September 1066. His army consisted of about 7,000 well-trained soldiers, including infantry, cavalry, and archers. William chose a strategic location to fortify his position near Hastings, building a wooden castle to protect his camp. Harold Godwinson assembled his army from Anglo-Saxon troops, including the elite huscarls, the king's personal bodyguards, and the militia, the Fyrds. The Anglo-Saxon army numbered about 7,000 men, but they were less organized and poorly rested from previous battles. Harold is believed to have died during the battle. Legend has it that he was killed by an arrow in his eye. His death led to the collapse of the Anglo-Saxon army and the end of the battle. The victory at Hastings opened William's path to London. By Christmas 1066, he was crowned in Westminster Abbey as William I, King of England. The consequences of this battle were enormous. England, ruled by Anglo-Saxon kings for over 600 years, came under the control of the Normans. Most of the Anglo-Saxon nobility lost their holdings, which were transferred to the Norman barons. The Normans began building castles throughout the country to consolidate their power. French language and culture became dominant in England, which had a huge impact on the development of the English language. French language and culture became dominant in England, which had a huge impact on the development of the English language. The Battle of Hastings remains one of the most studied battles in history. Its significance goes beyond its military success. It symbolizes the beginning of a new era in British history. One of the most famous testimonies of this event is the Bayeux Carpet, a unique embroidered tapestry about 70 meters long, which depicts in detail the course of the battle and the events leading up to it. Today, the site of the battle, known as Battle, is a historical monument. Tourists from all over the world come here to see the place where the fate of England was decided. However, victory in battle did not mean complete conquest of the country. William had to put down numerous rebellions. The most stubborn resistance was in the north of England. In response, William carried out a brutal campaign known as the Desolation of the North, which destroyed entire villages and starved thousands of people to death. Immediately after the conquest, William carried out a massive redistribution of land. Virtually all lands belonging to the Anglo-Saxon nobility were confiscated and given to Norman barons and knights loyal to the king. The feudal system introduced by William became the basis of England's social and economic structure for several centuries. The king remained the supreme owner of all land, which he distributed among his vassals. In turn, the vassals provided the king with military service and paid taxes. In order to control the holdings and economic condition of the country, the Book of Dreadful Court was created in 1086. This document was the first comprehensive land ownership register in Europe, including information on owners, plot sizes, yields, and taxes. Castles became one of the most visible symbols of Norman rule. William and his descendants built hundreds of castles throughout England to control territory and defend against rebellions. Early castles, such as the Tower of London, were built of wood, but soon they began to build stone fortifications that were more durable. Castles served not only as military fortresses, but also as administrative centers where taxes were collected and court decisions were made. Each castle was a small city surrounded by walls. Inside were living quarters, armories, churches, and even markets. Castles played an important role in consolidating the king's power, as each feudal lord was obliged to keep a castle in readiness for the defense of the kingdom. The church in medieval England was not only a religious, but also a political force. William the Conqueror actively intervened in the affairs of the church, appointing his supporters to key positions. Many Anglo-Saxon bishops were deposed, and Norman clerics took their place. One of the most important changes was the construction of new cathedrals and monasteries in the Norman style. Cathedrals such as Canterbury, York, and Durham became not only religious centers, but also symbols of Norman cultural influence. However, the church did not always obey the king. The conflict between secular and ecclesiastical power reached its peak in the reign of Henry II, when Archbishop Thomas Becket was murdered in 1170. His death shocked the whole of Europe, and he was soon canonized, and Canterbury became a place of pilgrimage. The incident was the result of complex political intrigue, a power struggle between the monarch and the church, and personal conflicts between two strong personalities, King Henry II and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The assassination of Thomas Becket had lasting consequences for the history of England and for the relationship between church and monarchy. It symbolized the struggle for the independence of the church from secular power and the increasing influence of the papacy. In medieval England, the archbishop became a symbol of moral authority and courage, willing to give his life for his beliefs. In addition, the incident strengthened the church's position against the monarchs, whose attempts to control the spiritual life of society had been hampered after Becket's murder. The conflict was also a milestone in the development of the English legal system, which increasingly questioned the absolute power of kings and contributed to the gradual consolidation of the principles of the rule of law. The Great Charter of Liberties was created to address problems with the excessive power of the monarch. The Magna Carta, signed in 1215, was one of the most important documents in the history of Britain and the world. Its significance goes far beyond its time. It symbolized the limitation of the absolute power of monarchs and laid the foundation for the development of constitutional systems and human rights. From the late 11th to the 13th century, Britain participated in the Crusades, which were a series of military campaigns organized under the banner of the Christian faith to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. Britain, as one of the leading European powers of the time, played a significant role in these events. Kings, knights, and common men from the British Isles traveled to the east, leaving a mark on the history of the Crusades. The Crusades began in 1095 when Pope Urban II called upon Christian Europe to liberate Jerusalem, which was under Muslim rule. For England, as for other European countries, there were several reasons for participating in the Crusades. Campaigners believed they were serving God, and participation in the campaign guaranteed absolution. English monarchs sought to strengthen their position in international politics. The campaigns provided opportunities for trade, land grabbing, and enrichment. Although the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, began before England was actively included in the crusading wars, individual English knights took part. They joined the armies of the Continental Crusaders, led by leaders such as Gottfried of Bouillon and Raymond IV of Toulouse. The English are believed to have played a role in the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, when the city was taken by the Crusaders and the Kingdom of Jerusalem was proclaimed. England's most significant contribution to the Crusades was its participation in the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, under Richard I, known as Richard the Lionheart. This campaign was organized in response to the capture of Jerusalem by the Muslim warlord Salah al-Din in 1187. The Third Crusade was a reaction to the capture of Jerusalem in 1187 by the Muslim Sultan Saladin. It attracted the attention of major European rulers, including Richard I, the Lion-Hearted, Philip II Augustus, and Frederick Barbarossa, who promised to liberate the holy sites. In 1187, Saladin, the Muslim Sultan of Egypt and Syria, captured Jerusalem, a major impetus for a new crusade. Richard the Lion-Hearted, Philip II, and Frederick I Barbarossa were the major leaders, giving the campaign great political weight. The armies of the Crusades first began their actions by besieging fortresses and port cities in Sicily and on the coast of the Holy Land. However, Frederick Barbarossa drowned in the River Self, and Philip II returned to Europe, leaving Richard the Lionheart alone. Richard the Lionheart won a decisive victory over Saladin's armies at the Battle of Arsuf, but Jerusalem was never taken. The crusade eventually ended with a truce between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. Christians were free to visit the holy places, but Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. England's participation in the Crusades had a significant impact on the country. Campaigns distracted monarchs from domestic affairs, which weakened their power. This was particularly evident in the reign of Richard I, who spent most of his time outside England, leaving the country in the hands of the regents. Financing the campaigns required huge expenditures, which led to higher taxes and increased discontent among the population. The Crusades facilitated cultural exchange. The English brought from the East new knowledge, technology, goods, and ideas that enriched European culture. The Crusades were an important page in the history of England and the entire Christian world. The participation of the English, especially in the Third Crusade, demonstrated their military power and political influence. But it was not only the struggle for their faith that shook 15th century England. The struggle for power between two noble houses became one of the biggest military conflicts in the country. The War of the Scarlet and White Rose, 1455 to 1487, was one of the bloodiest and most destructive civil wars in English history. The conflict between two noble houses, the Lancasters and Yorks, sharpened the struggle for the English throne, which lasted almost 30 years and changed the face of the Anglo-Saxon political system. The war not only affected dynastic ambitions, but also left a deep mark on the culture, economy, and politics of England. The roots of the war go back a long way, to the dynastic struggle for control of the English throne. In the 15th century, the English throne was jeopardized by weakening dynastic control and political intrigue. The death of Edward III, 1377, left the throne in the hands of his minor grandson Richard II. Richard II's reign was tumultuous, and he faced rebellions, including the Heimer Rebellion of 1381. After Richard II's abdication in 1399, Henry IV of Lancaster ascended the throne. This event began the dynastic struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York. The Lancasters were direct male descendants of Edward III through his son John of Gaunt, and the Yorks through his son Richard, Earl of Conwy. This kinship by right of succession was the cause of tensions between the two houses. The deterioration of the English monarchy in the 15th century, when kings such as Henry VI suffered from weakness and mental illness, causing political instability, played an important role in the conflict. Henry VI, King of England from 1422, was a very incapable ruler who suffered from mental illness. This caused his power to become increasingly unstable. In 1455, Richard, Duke of York, led a rebellion against Henry, claiming that he was the rightful claimant to the throne. In the first major battle, the Battle of St. Albans, 1455, the Yorkist forces were victorious, and Henry VI was captured. Despite the victory, however, Richard was unable to seize the throne and was forced to make a peace treaty. In 1460, after Henry VI regained power, Richard laid claim to the throne, causing a new outbreak of violence. The Battle of Northampton, 1460, again brought victory to the Yorkists, and Henry VI was recaptured. In 1461, after the brutal Battle of Tewkesbury, in which Henry II's son died, the Lancaster dynasty virtually ceased to exist. After the Battle of Tewkesbury, Edward IV, York, ascended the throne. His reign symbolized the victory of the House of York, and for several years the monarchy was secured to that house. The Battle of Barnet, 1471, consolidated Edward IV's power when he defeated the last challenger from the House of Lancaster, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known as the Architect of Kings. This victory finally cemented the Yorkists on the throne. After the Lancaster defeat, Henry VI was assassinated in the Tower in 1471, which was effectively the end of the Lancaster dynasty. After the death of Edward IV in 1483, the struggle for the throne resumed. Power passed to his infant son, Edward V, but the actual ruler was Richard III, his uncle, who seized the throne in a rebellion. The Battle of Bosworth, 1485, was the decisive battle between Richard III's army and Henry Tudor of the House of Lancaster, and was the climax of the war. Henry Tudor defeated Richard III, who was killed in the battle, and became king as Henry VII. From this point on, the Tudor dynasty came to power, uniting the two feuding houses through the marriage union of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. This unification was symbolized by a new coat of arms, the Tudor Rose, consisting of a white and a red rose, which represented the houses of York and Lancaster. The War of the Scarlet and White Rose not only determined the future of the English monarchy, but also changed the political landscape of England. The end of feudal fragmentation had come. The war weakened the feudal barons who had previously played an important role in politics. The new Tudor dynasty centralized power and created a more stable monarchy, which led to a stronger state in the future. The war caused a huge loss of life, disorganizing and devastating many regions of the country. Fear of a repeat of bloody conflicts led subsequent generations of monarchs to seek stability and peace. The merger of the houses of York and Lancaster through dynastic marriage gave rise to a new union, the House of Tudor, which stabilized the political situation in the country. The War of the Scarlet and White Rose symbolized a profound change in the political life of England. The struggle for the throne between the two great houses, the Yorks and the Lancasters, left an indelible mark on history, not only determining who would rule, but also shaping the foundations for future reforms. It was also a lesson to the English about the cost of dynastic wars and the importance of stable power. The Middle Ages were the time when the basic institutions of British society were formed. The feudal system, the strengthening of the monarchy, the influence of the church, and the gradual development of legal norms all created the foundation on which the modern state was built. This period was a time of great upheaval, but also of great achievement. Medieval England left behind a rich legacy that continues to influence British culture, politics, and society. On June 28, 1491, a boy is born in Greenwich to King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, to be named Henry VIII. As a child, Henry was intelligent, energetic, and talented, with an interest in music, hunting, sports, and learning. However, he did not ascend to the throne immediately. After the death of his older brother, Arthur, Henry became crown prince. Henry inherited the throne in 1509 at the age of 17, after the death of his father. On the surface, his reign began as a happy and successful one. He was young, charismatic, and many hoped he would become a great ruler. The first years of his reign, despite outward successes, became a time of instability and power struggles within the royal court itself. One of the first and most momentous events in Henry VIII's life was his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his older brother Arthur. This alliance was political, and the marriage to Catherine secured England's alliance with Spain, which was important for fighting France and other adversaries. However, years later, Henry began to become disillusioned with his marriage as he could not get a male heir from Catherine. The theological and political crisis caused by the need to ensure succession to the throne caused Henry to look for ways to dissolve his marriage to Catherine. In 1527, the king asked the Pope to annul the marriage. However, the Pope, Clement VII, refused, fearing interference from Spain, a Catholic country with powerful influence. This refusal was the decisive factor that led to the largest religious split in English history. In 1534, when Henry VIII did not receive permission from Rome to divorce, he made a radical decision. He founded the Anglican Church, separating it from the Roman Catholic Church and declaring himself head of this new church. This step was supported by Parliament and the general public, who saw in it an opportunity to strengthen national power and independence. The divorce from Catherine was officially recognized, and Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn in 1533, with whom he hoped to have an heir. Henry VIII was known for his many marriages as well as the tragic events surrounding his personal life. Of his 6 marriages, 2 ended in divorce, 2 ended in the execution of his wives, and the other 2 marriages were less dramatic. After divorcing Catherine, Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn, hoping she would give him an heir. However, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, rather than the desired son. Coupled with political intrigue at court, where opposition to Anne grew, she was accused of treason, witchcraft, and incest. In 1536, Anne was executed. Jane Seymour gave birth to Henry's long-awaited heir, Edward VI, but died shortly after the birth. Henry considered her his true queen and was deeply affected by her death. Next was his marriage to Anne of Cleves, which was arranged for political reasons, but Henry was disappointed in his wife and quickly divorced her. In 1540, Henry falls in love with Catherine Howard. Young and ambitious, she was executed 2 years into her reign for treason. Henry VIII's last marriage was to Catherine Parr. Catherine outlived the king and played an important role in the upbringing of his children. Henry VIII was not only a man of passionate personal ambition, but also a strong ruler who significantly changed the political and religious landscape of England. He led the Reformation and created the Anglican Church. The separation from the Roman Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England is one of Henry's greatest achievements. This move was not only due to personal and family problems, but also because he wanted to strengthen royal power and remove the influence of the Pope. Henry VIII assumed the title of head of the Church in England and placed church affairs under the control of the monarchy. Henry VIII implemented a number of economic reforms, including the confiscation of Catholic church lands. This allowed him not only to increase royal revenues, but also to increase his political power by securing the loyalty of the new landowners to whom he transferred the confiscated lands. Henry VIII strengthened central authority, increased the role of the royal council and parliament in governing the country, and improved the judicial system. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, at the age of 55. His reign was a time of revolutionary change in England's religion, culture, and politics. He left the country more powerful and independent, but also fragmented and filled with internal strife. The establishment of the Anglican Church and the consolidation of royal power were Henry's major achievements. His Reformation eventually led to the long-term division of Christian Europe into Catholics and Protestants. Henry VIII became a symbol of royalty and authoritarian rule. His personal tragedies, numerous marriages, and executions became part of the mythology surrounding his figure. His successors, including Edward VI, Margaret Tudor, and Elizabeth I, continued the development of his reforms and firmly established the Protestant movement in England. After the short and dramatic reign of Henry VIII's children, Edward VI and Mary I, Elizabeth I then came to the throne and ruled from 1558 to 1603. Her reign was an era of prosperity and cultural flourishing, often referred to as England's Golden Age. Elizabeth I managed to stabilize the religious situation in the country by approving the Act of Uniformity, which made Anglicanism the official religion. She also strengthened England's international position by repelling the threat from Spain. The victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588 symbolized the power of the English Navy. In the cultural sphere, Elizabeth's reign was marked by the flowering of English literature and theater. Such figures as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser made invaluable contributions to world culture. Elizabeth I remains one of the most prominent and iconic figures in the history of the British monarchy. Her reign was marked by stability, growing international influence, cultural flourishing, and a dramatic expansion of horizons for the country. Elizabeth has gone down in history as the greatest monarch of the Tudor era and the personification of England's golden age. One of the most striking episodes in the reign of Elizabeth I was her struggle with powerful Catholic Spain. The rivalry between the two powers was inevitable, given Spain's Catholic religious policy and England's Protestant orientation, as well as England's growing influence on the world stage. The most dramatic event was the Armada of 1588, an attempt by Philip II of Spain to invade England to restore Catholic rule in the country. A fleet of 130 ships and 30,000 soldiers was sent to overthrow Elizabeth and establish Catholic rule in England. However, the Spanish fleet was defeated, due in part to the more maneuverable and faster English ships, as well as bad weather. The victory at the Battle of Plymouth in 1588 was a decisive moment that cemented Elizabeth's status as a great leader and national hero. This victory secured England's dominance of the North Atlantic and strengthened its position as a maritime power, as well as expanding its trade and colonial interests. After the Armada, England began to actively expand its colonies, including the first attempts to explore the Americas, which later led to the creation of the Anglo-Saxon Empire. Elizabeth I inherited the conflict between the Catholic and Protestant churches that caused religious wars and persecution in Europe. Although her father, Henry VIII, had separated England from the Church of Rome, the country's reformation was far from complete. Her sister Mary I tried to bring England back to Catholicism, but after her death, Elizabeth made a decision that dramatically changed the religious landscape of the country. In 1559, the Elizabethan Act of Religious Tolerance was passed, which established the official Anglican Church as the state religion. This act attempted to reconcile Catholics and Protestants and bring harmony to the country. In reality, however, Protestant and Catholic groups continued to fight for power, and her reign was accompanied by frequent religious conflicts. Elizabeth was able to maintain stability in the country by resolving religious issues with intelligence and political flexibility. The reign of Elizabeth I was a time when the English economy, especially maritime trade and industry, flourished. England began to actively develop its colonial territories, especially in North America. The opening of new trade routes and the strengthening of ties with other countries provided a strong economic impetus for growth. Throughout her reign, culture and the arts were revitalized and became an important part of English identity. The Elizabethan era has gone down in history as the Golden Age, thanks to such outstanding figures as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser. It was during this period that a number of great works were written that are still considered the pinnacle of world literature. The Queen's patronage of the arts contributed to the development of theater, music, and art. Elizabeth I skillfully used her power to strengthen the monarchy and create a stable government. She maintained a strong central authority and followed a policy of caution, ensuring a balance between the various political groups in the country. One of her main achievements was the establishment of a strong administration and an effective justice system, which greatly strengthened the position of the crown. In addition, Elizabeth knew how to find a balance in her dealings with Parliament and know when to give in. Her political skill was that she often used Parliament as a vehicle for her ideas, but at the same time she was able to limit its influence while keeping power in her own hands. Her reign was also a time of strengthening the English aristocracy, which played an important role in supporting her power. Elizabeth I was a unique personality, whose influence extended far beyond her era. Her image as Virgin Queen embodied the unity of the nation and symbolized England's independence. Her long and successful reign, with its stability and power, was the foundation for the future successes of her dynasty and the whole of Britain. She remained true to her status as queen without a husband, which significantly raised her image in the eyes of the people. At the same time, she played a skillful diplomatic game, forging crucial political alliances and maintaining dynamic relations with other European monarchs. Elizabeth I left no descendants, causing the crown to pass to her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, beginning the Stuart dynasty. However, her legacy in culture, politics, and religion survived her death and continues to influence British history. After the death of Elizabeth I, the throne passed to her cousin James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, the founder of the Stuart dynasty. This event united England and Scotland under one crown, although political unification came much later. James VI, King of Scotland, after the death of his cousin Elizabeth I, who left no descendants, became King of England as James I in 1603. This marks the beginning of the Stuart dynasty in England, the first time in history that the two kingdoms of England and Scotland were united under one rule. The reign of James I was an important milestone in British history, as it marked the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of a new phase in the political development of the islands. James thus sought a strong monarchy and unity in the country, which led to his conflicts with Parliament. He was an advocate of absolutism and believed in the divine right of kings, which displeased parliamentarians who demanded more control over royal power. However, the reign of James I was also a time of development in English literature and culture, especially with the emergence of famous authors such as William Shakespeare, whose works were recognized during this period. James I was the Tudor successor, but his reign was marred by significant religious and political crises. James I was a Protestant, but he tried to set a moderate course to balance Catholics and Protestants in his royal policies. This led to the beginning of long conflicts with Parliament, which was more in favor of Protestant values. His son, Charles I, who became king in 1625, continued the policy of absolutism. This caused growing discontent with Parliament, which eventually led to the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651. The war was the result of conflicts between the royal government, which supported absolutism, and Parliament, which sought to limit its powers. After a severe conflict, Charles I was defeated and executed in 1649, ending the monarchy in England for several years. England was declared a republic under Oliver Cromwell, and the Stuarts were temporarily removed from power. Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658, is one of the most controversial and significant figures in English history. His life and career reflect the complexity of the political and religious processes that led to fundamental changes in 17th-century Britain. Cromwell was a central figure in the Civil War, the fall of the monarchy, and the establishment of the Republic in England, and a key figure in the period known as the Cromwellian Republic or the British Republic. After the execution of Charles I and the abolition of the monarchy, a republic was proclaimed in England. Oliver Cromwell became the de facto head of this new polity, initially as Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland. In 1653, after the dissolution of Parliament, Cromwell became sole ruler of the country, taking the title of Lord Protector and establishing a government in which his influence was absolute. During this period, Cromwell introduced reforms to strengthen the Puritan order and attempted to change the social and political structure of the country. He actively intervened in religious life, limiting the influence of the Anglican Church and Catholicism, upholding Puritan values, and seeking to create a kingdom of God on earth, where strict biblical laws would rule. His reign saw the beginning of a wave of religious persecution and cultural restrictions. Cromwell was not only an outstanding military leader, but also a brave political reformer. He significantly changed England's foreign policy by expanding its territorial interests. For example, in Ireland, where he waged a brutal military campaign in 1649, his army suppressed Irish rebellions, which left a bloody mark on the country's history. Many Irish people still view Cromwell's actions as a brutal suppression of national and religious rights. However, in the field of international affairs, Cromwell made significant advances. He rebuilt the English navy, increasing its power and influence on the world stage. In foreign policy, Cromwell sought to strengthen England's position in Europe, intervening in the 30 Years' War on the side of the Protestant states, and strengthening relations with the Netherlands, France, and other Protestant powers. After Oliver Cromwell's death in 1658, his son Richard Cromwell became Lord Protector but was unable to hold power. The weakness of his rule and internal contradictions in the republican system led to the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 when Charles II, son of the executed Charles I, returned to England as king. Charles II was known for his tolerance and love of the arts, and his reign was a time of economic and cultural recovery despite political and religious controversies. He ruled the country amidst growing conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, as well as turbulent relations with Parliament. James II, son of Charles II, became king in 1685. His reign proved highly unstable due to his open commitment to Catholicism and his attempt to reclaim the Catholic faith as the state religion. This caused misgivings among the Protestant population and the aristocracy. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution occurred when James II was deposed from the throne and replaced by his daughter, Mary II, and her husband, William III of Orange, who came to England with an army and forced James II to flee into exile. The revolution led to the Bill of Rights in 1689, which limited the monarchy and established parliamentary control. This was effectively the end of the Stuart dynasty in England. The Glorious Revolution, 1688, and the adoption of the Bill of Rights, 1689, were key events in the history of England, which not only changed the political picture of the country, but also had a significant impact on the development of democracy in the world. These events allowed England to avoid a bloody civil war and finally establish the principles of limited monarchy, which became the basis of the British Constitution and influenced the creation of similar documents in other countries. The Glorious Revolution was not just a military coup, but a turning point in the history of England when the principle was established that the power of the monarch was limited by law and the rights of the people were protected. The events of 1688 marked the end of the Stuart dynasty, the establishment of parliamentary power, and the beginning of the reign of William III and Mary II, who became monarchs under a constitutional monarchy. Charles II, son of the executed Charles I, restored the monarchy in 1660 after a period of republican rule, but his reign did not bring stability. When Charles II died in 1685, his brother James II ascended the throne. James II, a Catholic, was determined to consolidate royal power, which caused controversy with the Anglican majority and Parliament. James II's reign was a time of growing discontent as the king sought to restore Catholicism as the official religion of England and expand the monarch's power at the expense of Parliament. In response to these actions, Protestant leaders began looking for a way to remove James II from power. In 1688, a group of English aristocrats known as the Glorious Parliament offered an invitation to the Protestant Prince William of Orange, husband of Mary, daughter of James II, to lead a rebellion against the king. William, aware of the growing protest against James, agreed, and in November 1688 landed in England with an army. James II, unsupported by the army and seeing his power crumbling, fled into exile in France. Since there were no bloody battles and the transition of power took place without significant casualties, the event became known as the Glorious Revolution. After James II abdicated and William and Mary ascended the throne, the English demanded that they sign a document that would limit the monarchy and guarantee the rights of Parliament and the people. This document became known as the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was a crucial step towards establishing a constitutional monarchy in England. It guaranteed several key rights and freedoms that became the foundation for future democracies in Britain and elsewhere. The Glorious Revolution and the adoption of the Bill of Rights became the basis for establishing the principle of the primacy of law and the right of the people over royalty. These events arguably marked a turning point in the development of democracy and the rule of law in the world. Although William III and Mary II became monarchs, their rule was not absolute but limited to parliamentary action. This was an important step towards strengthening the parliamentary system in Britain, which later became the basis for the political system of many democracies. The Glorious Revolution also influenced the development of political theories. It showed that the power of the monarch could be limited by popular choice and institutions such as Parliament. The ideas arising from this process were reflected in political teachings such as liberalism and constitutionalism, which later influenced the formation of legislative systems in other countries, including the United States and France. The Bill of Rights, in turn, was one of the first examples of how the rights of citizens and limitations on the power of the monarch could be recorded in legal form. This document had a significant influence on the development of the British Constitution and was later used as a model for other constitutions around the world. The Glorious Revolution and the Bill of Rights was a milestone in English history when the principle that royal power is not absolute and cannot be above the law was finally articulated. This event changed the political landscape of Britain forever, setting the foundations for the development of parliamentarism and the protection of citizens' rights. The impact of these events is still felt today, both in British history and in the wider context of global political development. Another document whose influence continues today is the 1706 Treaty of Union, a historic as well as current legal document in the form of an international treaty that finally agreed on July 22, 1706, the details of the union of the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland into the new Kingdom of Great Britain, which later formed the basis of the 1707 Act of Union, ratified by the parliaments of the two countries. In February 1707, the treaty was approved by the English Parliament and went into effect on May 1st. After the overthrow of James II, the Stuarts continued to claim the British throne. Claims to power remained with James II's descendants, leading to several rebellions, the most famous of which was the Jacobite Rebellion of 1715 and 1745, when James II's descendants attempted to restore the Stuarts to the throne, but failed. The Jacobite Rebellion of 1745 was raised in Scotland by a young pretender, Charles Edward Stuart, in the hope of seizing the throne of Great Britain, which was ruled by King George II. The young pretender's father, James III, the Old Pretender, granted his son the status of Prince Regent in late 1743 to fully represent the dynasty. The Stuarts attempted to return to the British throne at a time when the main forces of the British Army were engaged in the War of the Austrian Succession. It was the penultimate, another would be made during the 7 Years' War, serious attempt by the exiled House of Stuart to regain the throne from Britain. The rebellion was also marked by the last major general battle in history, on the island of Great Britain, the Battle of Culloden, which took place in 1746. The rebellion ended with the defeat of the Jacobites. The last of the Stuarts, Charles Edward Stuart, also known as Prince Charlie, was defeated at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. From that time on, the Stuarts had no further claim to the British throne, and the Stuart dynasty effectively ceased to exist in Great Britain. The Tudor and Stuart periods were not only a time of political crises, but also of cultural and scientific flourishing. This period saw the emergence of such outstanding scientists as Isaac Newton, whose work laid the foundation for modern physics. Literature and the arts continued the flourishing that had begun under Elizabeth I. Theater, music, and painting played an important role in public life, and London became a center of cultural and economic prosperity. One of the events that turned the whole course of British history was the Industrial Revolution. One of the most important technologies that became the basis of the Industrial Revolution was the steam engine, perfected by Scottish engineer James Watt in 1769. Although the steam engine as a principle had been known since ancient Rome, its application in industry was only made possible by the achievements of Watt, who greatly improved its efficiency. This discovery opened a new era for industrial production. Based on these innovations, new types of production equipment such as weaving machines, spinning machines, and printing presses were developed. These devices increased productivity in textiles, machinery, and other industries, which in turn contributed to increased production, improved the quality of goods, and lowered production costs. The Industrial Revolution is also associated with the emergence and development of factories, large manufacturing plants where processes became mechanized. This was a radically new approach compared to the previous one based on manual labor and small workshops. The first textile mills appeared in Britain in the late 18th century. Workers who had previously been weaving by hand in homes or small workshops were now gathered in factories, where they worked under strict supervision and discipline. With the help of new technologies such as power looms, inline looms, and spinning machines, it became possible to produce fabrics much faster and in large quantities. One of the most prominent symbols of industrialization was Manchester, which, due to its strategic location, developed railway network and availability of labor, became the center of the textile industry in Great Britain. Manchester was nicknamed Manchester Lancaster and was the first city to feel the full impact of the factory revolution. The dramatic growth of cities such as Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham was one of the most important aspects of the Industrial Revolution. This period also saw the beginning of active urbanization in England. That is, the rapid growth of cities caused by people moving from the countryside to find work in factories. As the number of factories increased, new problems of population density, poor working conditions, pollution, and inadequate sanitation also emerged. Workers mostly labored in harsh conditions, often alone or in small workshops, and lived in crowded and unsanitary conditions. Often women and children also worked in the factories, which was part of the brutal labor practices of the time. One of the most important resources for running factories and machinery in Britain was coal. Unlike other countries where energy was extracted from natural sources such as rivers or windmills, Britain had vast reserves of coal, which became the main source of energy for steam engines, factories, and mills. Coal was so important that it became the backbone of the British economy in the 18th and 19th centuries. Coal mines were concentrated in areas such as Yorkshire, Shropshire, South Wales, and Lancashire. The energy base allowed for the development of production and the expansion of the territorial boundaries of industrialization. Miners who worked in dangerous and harsh conditions played a crucial role in supplying the country with coal. The process of coal mining was extremely labor-intensive and dangerous. Special mining techniques were used, hand tools, then the first steam pumps to pump out water and provide working conditions. Nevertheless, working in the mines was risky, and many miners were victims of cave-ins or methane explosions. Women and children also worked in coal mines, often subjected to brutal working conditions. As coal mining expanded, so did the influence of mining companies, which became powerful economic players. As the number of coal mines in Britain increased, so did the number of environmental, health, and safety concerns. The Industrial Revolution in Britain not only changed the methods of production, but also had a huge impact on social life. The process of urbanization led to the creation of new working classes with certain economic and social problems. The emergence of factories, mines, and other large production facilities contributed to economic growth, but it also reinforced class differences. The working class, who were engaged in manual labor in factories, faced poverty, poor living conditions, and low wages. In response to these conditions, movements to protect workers' rights, such as syndicates and labor unions, began to emerge and began to demand better working conditions and higher wages. An equally important result of the Industrial Revolution was the development of infrastructure. New railroads, canals, and bridges appeared, which improved communication between cities and regions. This facilitated not only the development of domestic trade, but also Britain's access to new international markets. The Industrial Revolution in Britain was a watershed moment in history. New technologies, the development of factories and coal mines changed the face of the country, making it a world leader in industry. Industrialization led to economic growth, urbanization, but also brought about problems related to social inequality and working conditions. Nevertheless, this period provided the foundation for a modern industrial society that influenced the entire world. For several centuries, Great Britain also expanded its territorial possessions around the world, establishing colonies that became the basis of its economic and political power. The beginning of the colonization of the British Empire dates back to the age of great discovery in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, when English navigators began to seek out new trade routes and lands. However, unlike many European countries such as Spain and Portugal, Britain focused on establishing trading posts and colonies in different parts of the world, which later allowed it to develop a powerful imperial network. India became one of the major and most lucrative targets of British colonial expansion. In the early 17th century, Britain established its trading post in India through the British East India Company, which at first focused solely on trade and then gradually began to expand its influence and control over larger territories. In the 19th century, during a period of new imperialist expansion, Britain greatly increased its holdings in Africa. This time is known as the Run for Africa, when European powers, including Britain, began to compete vigorously for new lands, resources, and markets. Britain acquired many African colonies, including territories such as the Union of South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and Kenya. These lands provided Britain with essential natural resources such as gold, diamonds, and oil, as well as the labor of the local population, often used under conditions of brutal exploitation. Trade played a central role in the establishment and prosperity of the British Empire. Britain created one of the most developed trading systems, which included a huge network of colonies that allowed it to control a significant part of the world market. The most important goods that Britain supplied to the world market were textiles, tea, sugar, tobacco, cocoa, and wheat. The slave trade, while morally unacceptable, also brought enormous profits. Britain monopolized the most important sea routes, using its powerful navy to transport goods, protect its colonies, and suppress competitors. London became the world's financial center, and ports such as Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow became key trading hubs. Trade with her colonies brought huge profits. However, trade alone did not explain the power of the British Empire. The factor that gave it financial stability and global influence was the innovative financial systems and banking network that allowed Britain to control not only physical goods, but also money in world markets. One of the cornerstones of the British Empire's greatness was its mighty navy, which made it possible not only to defend the colonies, but also to secure trade routes and suppress piracy and maritime competition. The British Royal Navy became the world's strongest navy in the 18th and 19th centuries, providing supremacy on all oceans. The British Navy played a key role in the Battle of Trafalgar, 1805, where the fleet under Horatio Nelson won a decisive victory over Napoleon's France. This victory secured Britain's supremacy at sea and cemented its status as the world's maritime power. In addition, British ships played an important role in maintaining imperial expansion by providing links between the colonies and the metropolis. The power of the Navy allowed Britain to maintain its global trade monopoly and prevent invasion by rival powers such as France and Spain. The society and culture of the British Empire in the 19th century, especially during the Victorian era, reflected the enormous impact the empire had on the world. This period was a time of great change, from social reforms to cultural revolutions. Britain experienced both economic growth and social strife, which was reflected in art, literature, architecture, and social politics. The Victorian era was an era of strengthening old traditions, creating new ideals and social structures, and the beginning of significant urban growth. In the early 19th century, Britain was undergoing strong social change. The Industrial Revolution led to the rapid growth of cities and the creation of new classes, primarily the working class, who worked in factories and mines, and the middle class, whose representatives took positions in commerce, law, education, and other fields. This led to significant changes in the structure of society and required major reforms. The 1832 reforms were one of the first steps towards democratizing the British political system. Parliamentary reform expanded suffrage and made it fairer by increasing the number of voters among the bourgeoisie. This step proved important as part of improving political representation for new segments of the population, such as industrialists and merchants. Social reforms, such as the first labor laws, attempted to improve working conditions in factories and mines where workers, including women and children, toiled in appalling conditions. Laws limiting the working day began to take effect in response to numerous protests and demands for better working conditions. One of the landmark steps was the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833. The Abolition Act ended slavery in the colonies, which was a significant moral achievement and an important step toward improving the legal system. With urban growth and industrialization, Britain faced growing social differences. The middle class grew significantly at the expense of industrialists, entrepreneurs, and educated professionals. At the same time, the working class faced harsh living and working conditions. The Victorian era covers the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. The Victorian era was a time when many values such as Puritanism, morality, and work ethic were widespread. These values played an important role in shaping the culture and social life of the time. Puritanism, which emphasized personal virtue, work ethic, moral purity, and modesty, became the foundation of Victorian morality. The family and the home were seen as the foundation of a stable society, and women were often called upon to remain in the role of keepers of domestic comfort. For men, on the other hand, diligence, duty, and responsibility were important. Modesty and restraint were essential components of Victorian society, and it was these ideals that became the basis for the cultural norms of the time. Society valued order, reverence, and respect for tradition. However, despite its outward austerity, the Victorian era was also a time when pseudoscience and moral paradoxes flourished. For example, while Puritanism blessed humility and obedience, at the other end of the spectrum, questions about the sexual revolution were developing, with a particularly vigorous debate about the morality of prostitution and sexual offenses. The Industrial Revolution led to the rapid growth of cities in Britain. Many people moving from rural areas in search of factory work contributed to the emergence of megacities such as London, Birmingham, Liverpool, and Manchester. This process of urbanization had a huge impact on society. Urban growth brought with it many social and economic problems. People moving to cities often found themselves in poor housing conditions, overcrowded and uninhabitable neighborhoods. Workers lived in cramped, dirty neighborhoods without proper sanitation, leading to the spread of epidemics such as cholera and typhoid fever. Working conditions in the factories also left much to be desired. The working day could last 12 to 16 hours, and wages were low. Despite laws limiting working hours and improving working conditions, reform was slow, and people continued to fight for their rights. One of the hallmarks of urban growth in Britain was the development of urban architecture. New factories, railroads, bridges, and numerous residential complexes were built. Gothic-style architecture, which symbolized moral rigor and stability, was particularly characteristic of this time. In the cultural sphere, the Victorian era was marked by the flourishing of literature, theater, and art. This period saw the emergence of writers such as Charles Dickens, George Eliot, Thomas Hardy, and Jane Austen, who not only reflected society but also criticized it, showing the injustice and misery of the working class. Victorian values and social reforms provided the foundation for Britain's future development. Although British society changed significantly in the years that followed, many principles, such as respect for work, family, and order, remained important throughout the 20th century. The growth of cities, in turn, initiated a long process of urbanization that continues to this day. The complexities of urbanization, such as problems with infrastructure and social protection, became an important part of the political debate in the following decades. Queen Victoria died on January 22, 1901, on the Isle of Wight. Her death marked the end of the Victorian era and the transition to the Edwardian era. Today, Victoria remains a symbol of stability, progress, and greatness of the British monarchy. Her reign laid the foundations for the modern world, making her one of the most important historical figures. The Victorian era left an indelible mark on British cultural and social life, continuing to influence social values, architecture, art, and literature. The 20th century was an era of major upheaval and change for Britain. The country faced devastating world wars, the loss of its status as a global empire, and significant social transformation. These events shaped modern Britain, influencing its political system, society, and place in the world. World War I, 1914 to 1918, began as a conflict between the great powers of Europe but soon became a global tragedy. Britain entered the war on August 4, 1914 after Germany invaded Belgium, which Britain had pledged to defend under the Treaty of 1839. In addition, the war was seen as a way to protect national interests and prevent German hegemony in Europe. The war also affected the British colonies, with thousands of soldiers from India, Australia, Canada, and Africa participating in the conflict. For example, the Indian Army played an important role in the battles in Mesopotamia and the Middle East, while Canadian troops made their mark at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, was one of the most tragic and significant conflicts in world history. For Great Britain, the conflict was not only a test of its military power, but also a significant stage in history that affected the political, economic, and social life of the country. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe was divided into two major blocs: the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and the Entente, France, Great Britain, Russia. Although Great Britain was not directly bound to commit to the war, its participation in the conflict was conditioned by several key factors. In 1904, Britain signed the Anglo-French Agreement, which provided for mutual support in the event of aggression. When Germany declared war on France on August 3, 1914, Britain in turn pledged to fulfill its part of the obligation. In 1839, Britain signed the Treaty of London, which guaranteed Belgium's neutrality. When Germany invaded Belgium in August 1914, violating this treaty, Britain was forced to enter the war. This invasion of Belgium was one of the occasions after which Britain declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914. Germany, which sought political and economic hegemony in Europe, threatened British interests, especially in maritime trade and colonies. At this time, Britain saw the preservation of its navy and trade routes as vital to maintaining the world economy and its status as a global power. The growing threat from Germany was another important factor for Britain to enter the war and resist the expansion of German influence. When Britain entered the war in 1914, German forces had already begun their advance on France through Belgium. The British First Army, known as the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, was deployed to Belgium to support France and stop the German advance. In the early months of the war, British troops clashed with the German army on the Western Front, and both sides quickly became immersed in trench warfare. From the beginning of the fall of 1914, soldiers found themselves in a brutal situation. The trenches were becoming a symbol of war in which high casualties and mud became an everyday reality. One of the most tragic and famous episodes of Britain's involvement in the war was the Battle of the Somme, which began on July 1, 1916. This battle was one of the largest and bloodiest in British history. For months, British troops had been trying to break through German defensive lines. The first 24 hours of the battle became the most brutal for the British Army. On the first day of fighting, about 20,000 soldiers were killed, and the number of wounded amounted to another 40,000. The Battle of the Somme is not only a tragedy with a huge number of casualties, but also an important moment when Britain began to realize the horrors of war. It had a huge impact on the morale of the British, many of whom were shocked by the scale of the loss of life. Another important moment on the Western Front was the Battle of Ypres, 1917, where German troops used chemical weapons, the first mass use of gas in history. Germany used poisonous substances, such as chlorine, against British and Canadian troops, which caused a wave of shock and moral repercussions. Britain, on the other hand, began to use its own chemical weapons, as well as introducing new methods of fighting, such as tanks, which later became an important part of the war. The war affected not only Britain, but also its colonies. Thousands of soldiers and workers from India, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa took part in the war effort, both on the Western Front and in other theaters of war. Of particular importance was the campaign in Mesopotamia and Central Asia, where troops from India participated. The vast majority of soldiers from India, Australia, and Canada fought on the fronts of Europe. Canadians, for example, became famous at the Battle of Vimy Ridge, where their troops were able to force their way through German defense lines. Britain also played a role in the conflict on the Eastern Front, supporting Russia in its fight against the Central Powers. Britain supplied arms and resources to Russia and also fought in Turkey and the Middle East, for example in campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. The First World War left Britain with a colossal human cost. More than 700,000 Britons died and millions were injured. Families were destroyed and whole generations endured the horror of war, which affected the moral and psychological state of the nation. Often, brutal recruitment methods were used, which meant the mass mobilization of young men. The expected quick end to the conflict, supposedly hindered by heroism and patriotism, did not materialize. Millions returned home with severe wounds and trauma, both physical and mental. Britain's economy was also hit hard by the war. The war took a significant financial toll. The British government went into huge debts, including to the United States. This financial burden contributed to long-term inflation and economic hardship. In addition, the Great War was a catalyst for social change. Many workers were given new opportunities in the workplace, and this played a role in the development of the labor movement and socialist ideas in the country. Women who worked in factories and mills and had active social lives began to demand greater participation in politics. The First World War significantly changed the political landscape of Great Britain. First of all, the war accelerated the processes of democratization. In 1918, the Voting Rights Extension Act was passed, which allowed women over 30 and men over 21 to participate in elections. Loss of human resources, moral decay, and economic instability led to political changes that stimulated the development of social reforms in the 1920s. British casualties in the war were enormous. Over 700,000 people were killed and around 1.6 million were injured. It was a colossal trauma to society, affecting almost every family in the country. Cultural and artistic works of the time, such as the poems of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, convey an atmosphere of loss and grief. The economic consequences of the war were also significant. The country accumulated huge debts, especially to the US, and experienced inflation and industrial decline. The stability of the pound sterling was undermined and unemployment rose. This increased tensions in society and led to a number of social protests, including labor strikes. Politically, the war accelerated the reform process. Women who were employed in factories and other sectors previously dominated by men began to demand equal rights. Limited suffrage for women was introduced in 1918, an important step toward their full political participation. The period from 1921 to 1939 was a time of significant political, economic, and social change for Britain. Britain emerged from the war with huge casualties and serious economic problems. Debts incurred to finance the war caused a financial crisis, and the decline of industry led to increased unemployment. In 1921, Ireland actually gained independence. The Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed, which established the Irish Free State, which remained a dominion of the British Empire. Northern Ireland remained part of the United Kingdom. During the same period, Britain maintained control of a vast empire, but nationalist movements in India, Egypt, and other colonies began to grow. The economic crisis caused by the decline of the coal industry peaked in 1926. The general strike, which lasted 9 days, involved millions of workers and became one of the largest social conflicts in British history. The 1920s saw a major shift in culture. Jazz, the automobile industry, and the advent of radio began to change the way British people lived. Women gained more rights, including the right to vote for women over 21, in 1928. The world economic crisis of 1929 hit Britain hard. Unemployment rates were as high as 20%, especially in industrialized regions such as the north of England and Wales. The state introduced austerity measures which caused discontent in society. With Hitler's rise to power in Germany, 1933, and the rise of fascism in Italy and Spain, Britain faced a new threat. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement was aimed at preventing another war. However, concessions such as the Munich Agreement of 1938 only delayed the conflict. Internal social problems continued to grow. Poverty, unemployment, and inequality became the subject of intense political struggle. The emergence of the Labour Party as a serious force changed the political landscape of the country. In the late 1930s, tensions in Europe reached a critical point. After Germany invaded Czechoslovakia and Poland, Great Britain declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, starting World War II. World War II began in 1939 when Germany attacked Poland, forcing Britain and France to declare war. Britain suffered heavy casualties in the early stages of the war, especially after Germany had captured most of Europe by mid-1940. After the evacuation of British troops from Dunkirk, Britain was left virtually alone against Nazi Germany. One of the most important moments of the war was the Battle of Britain, 1940. Germany tried to destroy the Royal Air Force and invade Britain, but through strategic defense and the use of new technology such as radar, the British were able to repel the Luftwaffe's attacks. This victory not only prevented the invasion, but also boosted the nation's spirit. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who came to power in 1940, became a symbol of determination and courage. His famous speeches inspired the nation to fight. "We will fight on the shores, we will fight in the fields and in the streets, we will never give up." Although Churchill's career in the interwar period was filled with both successes and failures, his true leadership was not revealed until 1940, when World War II broke out. Britain played a key role in World War II, entering the conflict on September 3, 1939, after Germany attacked Poland. Its involvement spanned multiple theaters of war and was one of the decisive factors in the Allied victory. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, but initially limited themselves to minimal action. This period is referred to as the Strange War because there was no active fighting on the Western Front. In May 1940, Germany launched a blitzkrieg in Western Europe. France was quickly defeated, and British troops surrounded at Dunkirk were evacuated in Operation Dynamo. This saved some 338,000 troops, but left Britain alone with Germany. Germany attempted to gain air supremacy, but was defeated. After the defeat in the Battle of Britain, Germany began a campaign of aerial bombardment of British cities, the Blitz. London and other cities were raided regularly, but this did not break the spirit of the British. At sea, the battle for the Atlantic unfolded, with German submarines attempting to cut off supplies from the United States and Canada. The British Navy played a key role in countering these threats. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the U.S. into the war, and the German attack on the USSR, 1941, opened the Eastern Front. The UK became part of a broad coalition of allies. Britain conducted successful operations in North Africa against Italian and German forces under the command of General Rommel. The victory at the Battle of El Alamein, 1942, was a turning point, strengthening the Allied position in the region. In 1943, the Allies launched a campaign in Italy, landing in Sicily and advancing northward. The UK actively participated in these operations but faced fierce resistance. Great Britain became the base of preparation for Operation Overlord, the invasion of German-occupied France. The operation began on June 6, 1944. British troops played an important role in the landing and subsequent battles. The British and American air forces conducted massive bombing raids on German cities, including Dresden and Hamburg. This had devastating effects on German infrastructure and morale. British troops participated in the liberation of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and other countries. Germany capitulated on May 8, 1945, which marked the end of the war in Europe. Although Britain's main focus was on Europe, it was also involved in the war with Japan. Important moments were the defense of India, the Burma Campaign, and the liberation of British colonies in Asia. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Great Britain has become a symbol of resilience and resistance to aggression. Churchill's speech on June 4, 1940, when he urged the nation to keep fighting no matter what, was one of the highlights of his premiership. From the outset, Churchill had built a policy of determined resistance in spite of pressure, especially after the French surrender in June 1940. He assumed leadership at the most critical moments of the war, and his diplomatic efforts led to the creation of crucial alliances, such as cooperation with the United States and the USSR. His relationship with U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt was the basis for further military cooperation, including the creation of the two countries' excellent cooperation in military production and intelligence. Churchill was also one of the initiators of the Allied landings in Normandy in 1944, which eventually led to the liberation of Europe from Nazi occupation. After the end of the war, Churchill returned to politics and was elected Prime Minister again in 1951, despite difficulties and crises. He continued to play an important role in international affairs, maintaining a special relationship with the United States and influencing the post-war world order. Churchill also became a vocal advocate of the Cold War, openly denouncing the Soviet Union and warning of the dangers of communism in the famous Fulton speech of 1946, where he used the term Iron Curtain to describe the division of Europe. Churchill was a man of deep convictions, known for his resilience, determination, and vitality. Despite all the difficulties, he remained a symbol of willpower and commitment to principle, making him one of the most distinguished leaders in British and world history. Although Britain was one of the victorious countries in World War II, the economic and political consequences of the conflict accelerated the process of the empire's disintegration. After the war, Britain was forced to grant independence to India, 1947, ushering in a wave of decolonization. Over the next decades, former colonies around the world became independent states. After the end of the war in 1945, Britain was faced with a destroyed infrastructure, debt load, and lack of resources. The country embarked on massive reconstruction programs. The government nationalized key sectors of the economy, such as coal, railroads, and energy, to speed up recovery. From 1948, Britain began receiving aid under the Marshall Plan, provided by the United States, which helped modernize industry and stabilize the economy. One of the most significant achievements of the post-war period was the creation of the welfare state. Based on the William Beveridge Report, a series of reforms were adopted to address poverty and inequality. The main elements of this system included National Health Service, established in 1948, which provided free health care for all citizens, payment of pensions and unemployment benefits, and also commanded reforms in education, including the introduction of compulsory secondary education for all children. These measures have improved the quality of life for millions of people and have become the bedrock of modern British society. The post-war decades were a time of social and cultural change. The growth of the middle class, the increase in the number of working women, migration from the former colonies, and the rise of youth culture led to a change in the traditional image of British society. By the 1960s, Britain had entered an era of new values characterized by liberalization, tolerance, and cultural diversity. The 20th century was a time of profound change for Britain, from heavy losses in the world wars to the transformation of its society and governance. Although the country lost its status as a global empire, it managed to adapt to the new realities, becoming a leader in social reform and a founder of the welfare system, which remains an important part of its legacy. The British monarchy occupies a unique place in world history, representing a combination of tradition and adaptation to modern realities. Queen Elizabeth II, who ruled from 1952 until her death in 2022, has become a symbol of stability and continuity, and the royal family continues to capture the attention of millions of people around the world. Elizabeth II was born on April 21, 1926, in London. She became queen at the age of 25 after the death of her father, King George VI, in 1952. Her reign lasted 70 years, making her the longest reigning monarch in British history. Elizabeth came to the throne in the post-war era, as the country was recovering from devastation. She became a symbol of new hope for Britons and strengthened the role of the monarchy in a changed world. During her reign, Britain lost its status as a colonial superpower, but Elizabeth actively promoted the preservation of the Commonwealth, which unites more than 50 countries. The royal family has faced a number of challenges, including the divorces of Princes Charles and Andrew, the tragic death of Princess Diana in 1997, and recent disagreements with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Despite this, the Queen has managed to maintain her reputation as a monarchy. Elizabeth successfully adapted the monarchy to modernity by opening her palaces to tourists, taking part in TV broadcasts, and strengthening her connection with the nation through annual Christmas addresses. The British royal family plays an important role in the life of the country, not only representing the monarchy, but also performing numerous charitable, public, and diplomatic duties. Elizabeth II's husband, Prince Philip, has been her pillar throughout their 73 years of marriage. He has been active in public life, especially in environmentalism and supporting young people. For example, the Duke of Edinburgh's awards program. The UK is proud of its healthcare system, which is based on the principles of universal coverage and access to care. The UK National Health Service was founded in 1948 and has since provided free tax-funded healthcare to all UK citizens. The NHS, as a crucial part of the British social system, has periodically faced challenges related to funding, population growth, and aging infrastructure. However, the system remains a source of pride for many Britons, and its protection has become an important political issue. The UK has a system of state education, which is free of charge for children from 5 to 18 years of age. The main stages of education include elementary school, secondary school, and further education in high schools, as well as universities. England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have different education systems, but all are based on the principles of equality of access. In recent decades, the UK has faced issues of educational reform, including problems with school funding, teaching quality, and access to higher education. However, despite this, British universities remain among the most prestigious in the world, and the UK continues to attract students from around the world. Britain has traditionally been considered a world cultural center. Many significant cultural movements, such as British modernism and postmodernism, originated in this country. In music, literature, film, and art, Britain not only preserves traditions, but also constantly creates new forms and genres. But in 2016, after a referendum, the UK decided to leave the European Union, an unexpected turn for both the country's domestic politics and the global economy. Brexit is a term that has come to symbolize the biggest political and economic changes that have taken place in the UK in the 21st century. It is an amalgamation of two words, Britain and exit, and it refers to the process of Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. The UK's journey to this decision has been long and complex, and the consequences are profound and far-reaching. To understand what led to the decision for Britain to leave the European Union, it is necessary to consider the main factors that have influenced British politics and society over the decades. The British have always shown a certain skepticism towards the European Union. Despite its participation in the creation of the European Economic Community in 1957, the UK has not always agreed with the political and economic integration processes that took place within the EU. In 1973, the UK joined the European Economic Community, the forerunner of the EU, but with a number of reservations. Particularly acute were the issues related to national sovereignty and rights that the UK lost as a result of participation in the EU. One of the most important factors that pushed the country to leave the EU was the issue of migration. The free movement of people within the EU led to an increase in the number of migrants, especially from Eastern European countries, which raised fears among a section of the British population about job losses, social pressures, and cultural changes. For many Britons, this was a cause for concern, especially among the working classes, who felt that high-skilled and low-skilled migrant workers were creating competition in the labor market. Since Britain left the EU, its relationship with Europe has changed. Britain now has no access to the EU internal market and does not participate in the decision-making process of European institutions such as the European Commission and the European Parliament. Brexit continues to be an important factor that will shape UK politics and the economy for decades to come. Trade, migration, security, and international relations remain at the center of political debate. Britain has come a long and exciting way from a small island on the western edge of Europe to one of the world's most influential centers of politics, economics, and culture. The country has gone through many changes, from ancient times when its land was settled by the Celts and Romans to the formation of a powerful empire covering large parts of the world. Vikings, Normans, Anglo-Saxons, Tudors, and Stuarts. Each new reign has left its mark on the history of Great Britain, which, despite all challenges, has managed to maintain its unique identity. During the Industrial Revolution and the Victorian era, Britain became the world's superpower, with its empire covering almost a quarter of the globe. However, even in the 20th century, despite the loss of empire and the effects of the world wars, the country continued to be an important player on the world stage. In recent decades, despite economic and political challenges, including Brexit, the UK has continued to maintain its influence on the global stage. Today, the UK is not only a center of finance and cultural events, but also a country where centuries of tradition intertwined with progress and innovation still live on. Both modern society and the future of the UK remain in constant transformation, and its role in the world will continue to evolve in line with changes in global politics, economics, and technology. What do you think the future holds for Britain? Will it continue its influence as a cultural and political center, or will it face new challenges that will change its course? Perhaps a new era is on the horizon, and Britain will once again find itself at the crossroads of world events, ready to make its mark on history. Britain's influence on world history cannot be overestimated. Many great changes, scientific discoveries, and cultural achievements have come from this country, and its legacy continues to influence all of humanity. From language to art, politics to technology, Britain has left an indelible mark, and that mark will be felt long into the future.